God. Can you believe that men, those evil bastards, have the audacity to make more money than women's? Like, you don't even know. You don't even know.
What?
You don't even know.
But I want to know.
You don't want to know.
I do want to know.
Do you?
Yes.
Okay, like, get this. Women, despite doing literally the exact same work as men, and I mean literally, only make 76 to 80 cents on the dollar that a man makes, depending on how inaccurate the study is. So, like, that's like 20-something cents a dollar. Can you believe that?
No.
You can't.
No, I can't believe that.
But you mean figuratively, right? Why aren't you saying it with the same sort of anger that I am?
Well, because I am incapable of believing that statistic due to the fact that I have the ability to use reason and logic.
What?
Kids these days. I've been saying kids these days since I was a kid myself, something I picked up, I think, from my mother. But it certainly serves me well in this day and age. This up-and-coming generation is going to be vastly different from any generation before it. They're almost like a new evolution of humanity. And those of us old fogies born in the 20th century are going to have a hard time relating. But that's a conversation for another day. Today, I want to talk about the gender wage gap. Mr. President.
Today, women account for almost half of the workforce. But the typical woman who works full-time still earns 79 cents for every dollar that the typical man does. The gap's even wider for women of color. A typical black working woman makes only 60 cents. A typical Latino woman makes only 55 cents for every dollar a white man earns. And that's not right. We're talking about oftentimes folks doing the same job and being paid differently.
Wow. So the 44th president of the United States said it, therefore it must be true. Am I right? Someone tell me, when was the point in history that we decided politicians never lie? Was that with Nixon or George W. Bush? I just can't keep these things straight. Seriously though, the statistic Obama cited is technically true. Politicians love technicalities, especially when they prey upon what simple people want to hear. Millions of women in the US take home lighter paychecks than their male coworkers. Fact. And no one wants to believe that their choices in life are the cause of these kinds of differences. No one wants to believe that biology can affect these differences. If I do the same exact job as someone else, I should make the same exact money. I think most normal people can relate to this. I absolutely can relate. Every job I've ever worked, on my very first day, I was a better employee than many of the people doing the same job and making more money than me. My first job, I worked at a grocery store. I started as a bagger and within 3 months was working every area of the store. Stock, produce, dairy, cashier. Cashiering was the summit and I was easily the best. Not to toot my own horn, but I had all the produce numbers memorized. I was a super duper fast. And because I was the fastest bagger, I was the guy who never got the bagger assist. I rang up the groceries and I bagged them, and I was still pushing people through my line faster than anyone. And yet, for some strange reason, I made less money than the dozen other women who had worked at the store much longer than me. How was this allowed, right? Being 15, I was incredibly frustrated. But that's life. I know that's not exactly a popular point of view with today's youths, but I don't really care. That's life. Now, before I move on to the whole point of this video, I want to talk a little bit about my perspective. This video isn't about statistics or studies. If you want a full-on wage gap debunking video, type the words wage gap debunked into the search box above and waste your day away with videos that will infect your brain with truth. This video is about me sharing my thoughts and opinions on the wage gap, some of which I haven't seen given much focus, and I think it's important for you to know a little bit about me and why my point of view might serve the issue at hand. You see, Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton can talk about the wage gap all day, but they're both politicians who were lawyers after college. They're not normal people, and they've never hired employees at a normal job. The same goes for 95% of feminists who you hear addressing the wage gap. And frankly, the same goes for many of the YouTubers who talk about it. Most of the people who get into a career on YouTube do so while they're in high school or college, and even those that have had jobs in the real world have rarely worked as hiring managers. I couldn't name one anyway. A year ago, I was working as middle management in one of the biggest cities with one of the largest transportation companies in the world. We'll call it Wolf Chauffeured Transportation Worldwide, or Wolf Limo for short, since I'm clearly not going to ramble off that title. Whatever. I managed the dispatch department, but also spent a goodly amount of time working with the fleet, and I was on the so-called corporate fast track. I have hired employees. Thankfully, I never had to fire any. I worked my way up to the position and made enough to survive on my own in Los Angeles, which is a feat. Honestly, it's so expensive there. With my salary, I could have been living la vida loca in pretty much any other place. Ultimately, I quit the job because it turned out that I wasn't soulless enough to be happy in a management role. The things the higher-ups were willing to do in the name of saving a nickel honestly made me sick. I had to make decisions that made me disgusted with myself. And, well, whatever. I don't want to talk about it. The point is, when I eventually arrived in the online world of social and political things, I heard about the wage gap, and my first instinct was to question its validity. There are too many factors to account for any survey or set of statistics to possibly accurately say that a gap exists one way or the other. So, in the spirit of sharing my wisdom, which I earned through years of experience, I will share a short list of reasons that could explain why it might appear as though a wage gap exists when it most certainly doesn't.
Making your way in the world today takes everything you've got.
After all that, this one is less about my experience and more about common sense that seems to constantly escape people, especially of the younger generation. Yeah, whippersnappers. The Equal Pay Act was signed into law on June 10th, 1963. In the grand scheme of things, 53 years is a very, very short amount of time. At the time it was passed, being a wife and a homemaker was still by far the preferred profession of women. If you hear a feminist tell it, once women entered the workplace, they all rushed out immediately into it. But that's so far from the case. Call it what you will. Maybe it was internalized misogyny, or maybe most women simply wanted what their mothers had, as is our way. So it took time for women to become normal fixtures in the workplace. I haven't heard anyone say that sexism doesn't still exist. I know from personal experience that it does. My boss tried to stop me from hiring women on several occasions. Straight up. Our office was staffed to a bare minimum. If someone called out sick, a manager had to cover. In his experience, and honestly in my experience, female employees tended to call out sick more often, or call in late more often. They left early more often. These are all the bane of a manager's existence, so it's natural to want to avoid the headaches if possible. But I kept hiring the best candidate, and in most cases that was a woman. I wasn't raised like my boss was, and he'll be retired in 5 years, and most likely the job will go to someone in my generation. Time. It's a real thing. Nothing changes overnight.
Taking a break from all your worries sure would help a lot.
In case you didn't know, most companies in the US operate in systems that value and reward seniority. Seniority is what happens when you work at a place for more than a month. This issue ties into the previous one because while women were slowly integrating themselves into the workforce, men were already there. Right or wrong, men were building up seniority in their careers when women were just getting started. So a man who has worked at a company for 30 years, even if he performs the exact same job as a woman who has only been there for 10 years, will earn a higher wage. Many companies dole out raises annually, so a man working in a place for 1 year could easily make more money than a newly hired woman. So duh, should be the thought forming squarely in your head right now. While it seems that women do tend to stay with their jobs longer now, for the older generation it was the opposite. Many older men have been in the same job for decades, but we often see older women still applying for new jobs. When you consider that the back half of the workforce, age-wise, are mostly older men with decades of seniority, that easily explains a large portion of why wages could seem skewed. Also, look at the situation with colleges these days. Far more women are going to college than men. While I'd guess that many guys are sitting at home playing on their PS4s and Xboxes, many are doing what I did and working, earning job experience and seniority. Meanwhile, 4 years after high school, there are thousands of women walking out of colleges with more or less meaningless degrees in things like gender studies. If you take a job like Wolf Limo, whenever I had an opening, having a useless degree on an application did basically nothing for you. I wanted industry experience first, degrees that fit the industry second. Everyone else sat at the bottom of the call list. I know for a fact that this is the case at many companies. 4 years at a university tells me nothing about what kind of a worker you are, and it certainly doesn't seem to help in interviews either.
Wouldn't you like to get away?
Every time the wage gap comes up in an argument, the first thing you hear feminists say is that women make less money for doing the same job. The response I want to give every time I hear it is, define same job. It may be slightly sexist for me to say this, and I know that I'm biased based on my own personal drive and ability, but men and women are very different. And having the same job title and doing the same work says absolutely nothing about the quantity or the timeliness of the work done. If I can do the job in 4 hours and it takes my female coworker 6, should I not be paid more? I, personally, have never been outdone by a woman in a job. I've always been faster. I've always been more efficient. As a manager, my best employees were all men. My most efficient, most reliable employees were men. Now, I'm not saying this is always the case. I'm not. I have worked with plenty of men who sucked. But men and women are different. We have very different biological gifts. This is why so few women work in the STEM fields. It's not because teachers aren't telling little girls they can do anything they want. Every classroom I've ever learned in, teachers have told girls they can do anything they put their mind to. It has been a massive part of our society over the last 30 years. Most of the teachers, especially in elementary school, are women. Women paid to empower girls. But some subjects are better suited for one gender than another. There is no way around this short of human evolution, which could be happening as we speak, but we're not talking about the future. We're talking about today. Is it possible that the monotonous repetitiveness of full-time work plays more to the strengths of men than to women? The other argument you hear is that primarily female jobs get paid less than primarily male jobs, even though they are just as important. Every time someone talks about the pay gap, my usual comeback is something along the lines of, women won't be happy until nurses are paid the same as surgeons. I honestly think this is the way that most feminists think. Why aren't elementary school teachers paid as much as high school teachers or college professors? Why aren't secretaries paid as much as CEOs? If you need to ask the question, you're never going to accept the answer. The truth is that these jobs were valued as less from the very beginning, long before women were a regular part of the workforce. They aren't as dangerous as construction work. They don't involve the heavy lifting that many factory jobs require. I read an article that talked about how these jobs were given to women because they were deemed less important, as though sexism had something to do with it. Less important than garbage collection? Less important than sewage inspectors? There are many jobs where men are forced to break their backs on a daily basis because women simply cannot do it, or cannot do the job nearly as effectively. Jobs that involve extremely hard work. Yes, harder than sitting behind a desk half or all of the day. These jobs will always pay more because you have to offer more to get people to be willing to do them. That's life.
All those nights when you've got no lights, the check is in the mail.
When the numbers were all combined to come up with the wage gap, did they account for the fact that different companies pay different wages? Or that different states have different minimum wages and costs of living? If a man is a dispatcher in New York City for Wolf Limo and makes $30 an hour, but a woman in Detroit does the same job but only makes $12 an hour, do you think that's about equality? I don't know if this is a valid argument. I honestly don't. The opposite could be true. But do you think we should trust statistics that don't bother to account for these differences? In the description below, I'm going to link the document that feminists will point you to that supposedly proves that women earn less money in every single career field. If you take the time to look at it, you'll quickly find that many of the fields in the document are left blank. They're blank because it's not possible to gather all this information without the participation of every single company operating within the country. I'm an innocent until proven guilty kind of guy. When your claim has zero evidence, I'd say it's not true until you prove that it's true. And no matter what anyone tries to tell you, there is no evidence that proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that a wage gap exists. On the contrary, Times.com released a survey back in 2010 that showed that unmarried women under the age of 30 made more money than men in the same circumstances. 6 years later, there is no doubt in my mind that the number has swung even further in that direction. When politicians started using this propaganda to get elected, they set the wheels in motion to push women forward, despite the fact that there was no evidence to show that women were still being held back. My guess would be that 10 years from now, men's rights activists will be the new feminists on this issue, because women will be making 30% more than men. Meanwhile, the feminists will be saying that it's only fair because men had their time in the sun.
Your little angel hung the cat up by its tail.
Propaganda that plays to popularity. In recent years, we've heard stories of women like Jennifer Lawrence, actresses, claiming to earn less money than their male counterparts. You may have also heard recently that the women's U.S. national soccer team is suing because they are paid less than the men's team, which didn't go nearly as far in the World Cup. In each story, you find that they point to the gender wage gap. This is ridiculous for many, many reasons. But the biggest reason is that these women are not a part of the wage gap at all on any level. The wage gap only includes full-time, salaried, and hourly employees. Actors and actresses and sports stars, they're all independent contractors. They don't get paid an hourly wage. They get paid based on contracts. So when the gender wage gap is brought into these discussions or in news articles, it couldn't possibly be more disingenuous. Independent contractual work has no relation to normal hourly wages on any level. You electively sign a contract. You get paid what you can negotiate to get paid, often based on factors and circumstances that have very little to do with the actual work. Take American Hustle, the Jennifer Lawrence film. J-Law was upset that she made less money than Christian Bale, Bradley Cooper, and Jeremy Renner. At the time the contracts were signed, all three men had more star power and critical success than Jennifer Lawrence. Their agents negotiated their contracts based on this fact. Her role was far smaller than Bale's and Cooper's. While about the same size as Jeremy Renner's, most likely his agent said he wasn't doing it unless he was paid like the other two men. At that point, the producers could have found someone else, but they decided his name and his star power were worth it. Jennifer's agent could have done the same, maybe even tried. Maybe the producers felt they could find someone else. Maybe they felt the role wasn't as important. Maybe they had already hired the three men and paid far too much. And then once they went to hire her, they couldn't afford to pay her as much. We'll never know the circumstances. But what we do know is that she willfully signed the contract. Equality was not an issue. If she felt that it was, she could have found another film that would have paid her more. As for the women's soccer team, I'm going to link you to a video by Sargon of Akkad below if you're interested. The bottom line in that story is that millions more people watch men's soccer than they watch women's soccer. Ratings translate to ad money, which then translates to pay. Simple mathematics, basic economics 101, and life. It's life. I worked just as hard making my last video as PewDiePie did making his previous video. Sure, he has millions of subs, and well, I don't, but shouldn't I be able to sue YouTube because I didn't make as much money on that video as he did, even though technically we did the exact same job? If you're a lawyer and you think I should, DM me! I can use some cash. Seriously, bring it on. But chances are, if you do, I'm just going to think you're an idiot. So maybe don't waste your time. Or mine.
Sometimes you wanna go where everybody knows your name.
So those are just a few points I felt like I needed to get off my chest. People who lack perspective often lack the ability to view a situation with logic and reason. But ignorance isn't an argument or an excuse. Anyone who accepts that there is a wage gap because someone added up all the male wages and the female wages, then averaged them out, and ta-da! Huge gap! Anyone who accepts that as factual is purposely allowing themselves to be misled, because what they're being told fits perfectly within their worldview. If someone told me that all men are unhappy because women are insufferable, and they showed me how they added up all the men who had bad experiences with women versus all the women who had bad experiences with men, and then they averaged it out, and look at that! Every man has 26% more bad experiences than women. Well, yeah, I guess my gut reaction would be to accept that as fact. But that would probably be wrong. At minimum, I'd have to admit that it's something that a simple math problem couldn't possibly solve. So if you're a wage gap believer and you're watching this, all I ask is that you consider this one simple reality. There are way too many factors to consider for anyone to say whether a wage gap does or does not exist. And if you give me that, then you also have to allow that anyone preaching the existence of a gap is doing so with an agenda. And if you'll give me that, then you have to allow that people who have an agenda that involves misleading people are at best incredibly ignorant and at worst diabolically evil. And is that really the sort of person you want to associate yourself with? Thanks for watching. And if you like my content, please give it a thumbs up or, subscribe if you want. It helps my ego quite a lot. So, arrivederci, my friends. I'll at you later.